There is a law written not in books, but in the unseen currents of life. What a person clings to most tightly becomes the very thing that leads them to their undoing, and among all attachments, none is more fragile, more predictable, and more easily turned than the human ego. The ego craves recognition. It hungers for validation. It demands to be seen as right, superior, untouchable, and in this craving, it reveals its weakness. For anything that must constantly be fed is not power, it is dependence. When you understand this, you no longer fight your enemies with force, resistance, or argument. You simply allow their ego to guide them into their own defeat. The world teaches you to react to, defend, to argue, to prove yourself. But there is a higher way, a quieter way, a way that requires no struggle, yet produces certain victory. When faced with an enemy driven by ego, do not challenge them directly. Do not try to humble them. That is a battle you need not fight. Instead, step aside. Let them believe they are winning. Let them feel superior. Let them speak, boast, and display themselves. For the ego, when inflated, loses balance. A person ruled by ego cannot see clearly. They overestimate their strength. They underestimate others. They reveal too much. They act too quickly. They expose their intentions without knowing it, and in doing so, they create their own downfall. You see, truth does not need to shout. Power does not need to prove itself. The one who is truly aligned with divine order moves in silence and watches as illusion collapses on its own. If someone seeks to provoke you, it is because your reaction feeds their ego. Deny them that nourishment. Remain calm. Remain still. Let your silence become a mirror in which they see only themselves. And most cannot bear that reflection for long. If someone seeks to dominate, give them the illusion of control. Agree where it costs you nothing. Yield where it strengthens your position. The ego mistakes compliance for victory, never realizing it has walked exactly where it was led. This is not deception. This is wisdom, for the universe does not reward force, it rewards alignment. And when you refuse to engage in ego-driven conflict, you rise above the battlefield entirely. You are no longer reacting, you are directing. You begin to see that your enemy is not truly your enemy. They are simply a participant in a greater law, revealing through their behavior the path to your advantage. The ego is loud, impatient, and blind. But you are none of these things. You are steady. You are aware. You are guided. And so, while they rush forward seeking victory, you remain grounded, allowing their own nature to undo them. Never interrupt an enemy who is revealing their weakness. Never argue with someone who is exposing their insecurity. Never compete with someone who is driven by the need to prove. Instead, observe, allow, align. For, in this stillness, you hold the greater power. The law is simple. What a person worships, they serve. And the one who serves their ego becomes its prisoner. But you serve a higher order. And in that alignment, victory is not something you chase. It is something that arrives. Ego is not strength, though it often disguises itself as such. It is a fragile construct, constantly seeking confirmation from the outside world to sustain its illusion of power. A person ruled by ego must be seen, must be acknowledged, must feel superior in order to maintain their sense of identity. This constant need creates a silent dependency, and within that dependency lies a powerful vulnerability. When someone requires validation, they are no longer in control of themselves. They are controlled by the reactions of others. This is where true understanding begins. The one who sees the ego clearly recognizes that it does not need to be attacked, challenged, or broken. It only needs to be observed and allowed to function as it naturally does. The ego, when left unchecked, reveals its own patterns. It seeks praise, it exaggerates its abilities, it dismisses others, and it moves with a false sense of certainty. Each of these behaviors creates opening subtle cracks, through which influence can quietly enter. A person driven by ego cannot tolerate being ignored, they interpret silence as disrespect, as dismissal, as a threat to their importance, and so they begin to overextend themselves, trying harder to gain attention, to prove their worth, to reassert their position. In doing so, they reveal more than they intend, they speak too much, act too quickly, and expose their true motivations without realizing it. What they believe to be strength becomes a display of their inner need. When you understand this, you no longer feel compelled to oppose them. You do not correct them when they boast. You do not challenge them when they exaggerate. You do not compete with them when they seek dominance. Instead, you allow them the space to express their ego fully. You give them the stage they crave, knowing that in doing so, they will eventually lose control of the very image they are trying to protect. Validation becomes the key, not in the sense of genuine admiration, but in the strategic allowance of their need to feel superior. When you offer small acknowledgments, when you let them believe they are ahead, when you agree in ways that do not compromise your position, you feed just enough of their ego to guide their behavior. They begin to trust their illusion more deeply. They become less cautious, less aware, and more predictable. Predictability is where influence is born. An ego-driven person follows patterns. They seek situations where they can shine. They avoid circumstances where they might be questioned. They gravitate toward praise and retreat from criticism. Once you see these patterns, you can anticipate their actions before they take them. You no longer react to what they do, you position yourself in advance of it. This is not manipulation in the crude sense. It is alignment with the natural tendencies of human behavior. Just as water flows in the direction of least resistance, the ego moves toward what feeds it and away from what threatens it. By understanding this flow, you do not need to force outcomes, you simply guide the current. Consider how easily a person reveals their intentions when they are eager to impress. They speak of their plans, their strategies, their ambitions often. Without being asked, they want recognition for their thinking, for their vision, for their perceived superiority, in their desire to be admired. They surrender information that a more disciplined mind would keep hidden. They trade discretion for validation, and so, by giving them the attention they seek, you receive the insight you need. At the same time, the ego blinds. It convinces a person that they are always right, always capable, always in control. This illusion prevents them from seeing risks, from acknowledging limitations, from preparing for opposition. They underestimate others because they overestimate themselves. They assume victory before the outcome is decided. They move forward with confidence, unaware that their certainty is not grounded in reality. This blindness creates opportunities that do not need to be forced. They arise naturally as the ego distorts perception. All that is required is patience. While they rush forward, driven by the need to prove, you remain steady. While they seek immediate recognition, you focus on long-term positioning. While they expose themselves, you remain composed and observant. There is a quiet power in restraint. The ego cannot comprehend it because it equates stillness with weakness. It believes that those who do not assert themselves must lack the ability to do so, and in that belief, it lowers its guard. It becomes careless, assuming that there is no real opposition. This assumption is one of its greatest flaws. By the time the ego realizes it has been misled, it is often too late. The patterns have already played out. The decisions have already been made. The consequences have already begun to unfold, and all of it happened without direct confrontation, without visible conflict, without force. This is the deeper truth. Control does not come from overpowering others, but from understanding what drives them. The ego is one of the most consistent and predictable forces in human behavior. It follows its own rules regardless of the situation. It seeks elevation, avoids humility, and reacts strongly to anything that threatens its image. When you recognize these tendencies, you begin to see that the ego does not need to be opposed. It needs to be allowed to expand, allowed to express, allowed to reveal itself fully. In that revelation, it creates its own limitations. It locks itself into patterns that can be anticipated and guided. And so, the greatest weakness is not a lack of ability, but a dependence on recognition. The one who needs to be seen can be directed by what they are shown. The one who needs to be praised can be influenced by what they are given. The one who needs to feel superior can be led by the illusion of superiority. You do not take their power. You let them hand it to you, piece by piece, every time they seek validation instead of truth. Every time they choose appearance over awareness. Every time they follow the voice of ego instead of the clarity of perception. Silence is often misunderstood. It is seen as passivity, as weakness, as the absence of power. Yet in truth, silence is one of the most precise instruments of control. It is the space in which the ego finds no reflection, no resistance, no confirmation of its importance. And without that reflection, the ego begins to unravel. The ego feeds on reaction. It seeks engagement, whether in the form of agreement or opposition. Praise strengthens it, but even conflict sustains it because conflict acknowledges its presence. To argue with an ego-driven person is to give them exactly what they want to stage upon.